"Just pretend you're my date," the CEO whispered, her voice so steady that only the man beside her noticed the fear hiding underneath it. Graham Mercer looked at Claire Whitmore for a long second before giving the smallest nod. "If that's what you need," he answered quietly. Around them, crystal chandeliers bathed the grand ballroom of the Ashford Regency Hotel in warm golden light while a string quartet floated gentle melodies through the air. Hundreds of executives, investors, and political leaders laughed beneath towering floral arrangements, their polished shoes gliding across marble floors that reflected every sparkle above. It should have been another glamorous charity gala, another evening where fortunes were pledged with champagne toasts and polished speeches. Instead, it was becoming something no one inside the room would ever forget. Claire adjusted the silver bracelet around her wrist, drawing a slow breath she hoped no one would notice. She had built one of America's fastest-growing cybersecurity companies before turning 35. She negotiated billion-dollar contracts without flinching. She faced hostile boardrooms with confidence that inspired thousands of employees. Yet standing only inches away from Graham, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to admit in years. She was afraid. Not because of the cameras. Not because of the reporters waiting outside. But because somewhere beyond the ballroom entrance, the man she had finally escaped had promised to ruin her evening. Graham stood beside her wearing a charcoal suit that had clearly seen many seasons. Nothing about him attracted attention. His tie was neatly knotted, his shoes carefully polished, and his calm blue eyes wandered across the ballroom with quiet awareness instead of curiosity. Most guests dismissed him before taking a second glance. To them, he looked exactly like what Claire had introduced him as moments earlier. A single dad. An accountant. An ordinary man who had somehow wandered into a world of private jets, luxury watches, and impossible wealth. Whispered laughter drifted through nearby conversations. Someone smiled politely before asking another guest if Claire had hired an employee to keep her company. Another guessed he must be a financial consultant who had misunderstood the dress code. Graham heard every word. He simply smiled to himself, as though none of it belonged to him. Years of raising his young daughter alone had taught him that pride was rarely worth protecting when peace could accomplish far more. Claire glanced toward him again. "I'm sorry you got pulled into this," she whispered. Graham answered with the same quiet expression that never seemed to change. "Sometimes the right place finds us before we know why." Before Claire could respond, the music softened. Conversation slowed. 3 sharply dressed men stepped through the ballroom entrance with measured confidence, making several guests instinctively move aside. Behind them walked Damien Cross, wearing the smile of someone convinced the evening already belonged to him. Claire's heartbeat faltered. Graham simply folded one hand over the other, standing as calmly as if he were waiting outside his daughter's elementary school. No one in the ballroom knew that within minutes, everything they believed about the quiet accountant would begin to unravel, and the truth he had carried in silence for years would leave even the most powerful people in the room searching for words. Before the story takes a turn, subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss what happens next. And tell me, do you think she should trust him? Let me know in the comments. Now, let's continue. Damien Cross paused just inside the ballroom entrance as though the entire evening had been arranged for his arrival. His tailored navy tuxedo fit perfectly, his silver cuff links caught the glow of the chandeliers, and the confident smile on his face reflected years of believing that money could solve every problem before it ever became one. The 3 men walking several steps behind him wore matching black suits, discreet earpieces, and calm expressions that suggested professional discipline rather than intimidation. They remained silent, scanning the room without drawing attention to themselves. Guests recognized Damien immediately. A wave of polite greetings rolled across the ballroom, followed by respectful handshakes and carefully practiced smiles. Several investors approached him first, eager to remain in the good graces of a man whose companies had influence across multiple industries. Claire watched quietly without moving. She had once stood proudly beside Damien at events exactly like this. Magazine covers had celebrated them as the next great power couple of American business. Headlines praised their ambition, their intelligence, and their combined fortune. None of those articles ever mentioned the exhausting reality behind the cameras. They never described the endless need for control, the quiet pressure to surrender every independent decision, or the loneliness that could exist while standing beside someone admired by the world. Graham noticed the tension in her hands before he noticed anything else. Her fingers tightened gently around the small evening clutch she carried, while her shoulders remained perfectly straight. She had mastered the appearance of confidence because thousands of employees depended upon it every day. Even now, surrounded by people who respected her success, she refused to let fear become visible. Graham admired that more than any title she carried. His own life had taught him that courage was often silent. Years earlier, after losing his wife to an unexpected illness, every morning had begun before sunrise. He prepared breakfast, packed school lunches, braided his daughter Lily's hair as best he could after watching countless online tutorials, and drove her to school before arriving at a modest accounting firm where few co-workers knew anything about his personal life. Numbers were predictable. Tax forms followed rules. Financial statements rarely surprised anyone. That quiet routine gave him something priceless. Stability for the only person who mattered most. His co-workers respected him because deadlines were always met and mistakes were almost non-existent. They never asked why he occasionally stared through the office window with distant eyes whenever helicopters crossed the city skyline. They assumed he simply enjoyed the view. Graham never corrected them. Some chapters of life were not meant for casual conversation. Across the ballroom, Damien finally spotted Claire. His smile widened, but his eyes remained cold. He began walking toward her with slow confidence, greeting familiar faces along the way as if nothing in the world could possibly interrupt his plans. Several nearby guests noticed the direction he was heading and quietly stepped aside, sensing an uncomfortable reunion. Claire released a careful breath. Graham spoke softly without taking his eyes off the approaching crowd. "You do not have to prove anything tonight." She looked at him with quiet surprise. "Neither do you," she replied. Graham offered the faintest smile. "That makes two of us." The orchestra continued playing a gentle melody while crystal glasses clinked and quiet conversations filled the elegant room. Yet beneath the polished surface, something invisible had already begun to change, like the stillness that settles over a summer field moments before distant thunder finally reaches the horizon. Damien stopped a few feet away, his polished smile never slipping as he studied Claire and then shifted his attention to the quiet man standing beside her. Around them, conversations softened into careful whispers. The ballroom remained bright with laughter and music, yet the small circle surrounding the three of them suddenly felt strangely still. Damien lifted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server and spoke with effortless charm. "Claire, I have to admit, I did not expect this." His eyes settled on Graham with measured curiosity. "You certainly know how to surprise people." Claire met his gaze without flinching. "Good evening, Damien." "Only good," he replied with a practiced laugh that encouraged a few nearby guests to chuckle along. "After everything we built together, I hoped for something warmer." Graham remained silent. His hands rested naturally at his sides, his posture relaxed, his attention focused not on Damien's words but on Claire's expression. She was calm on the surface, yet he could see the tiny change in her breathing each time Damien took another step closer. Years of reading balance sheets had taught him that small details often revealed the truth hidden beneath. Polished numbers. People were rarely different. Damien tilted his head slightly. "You have not introduced your guest." Claire answered before hesitation could appear. "This is Graham Mercer." Damien extended his hand with a confident smile. "Pleasure to meet you." Graham accepted the handshake with steady courtesy. "Likewise." Damien noticed the firm but controlled grip and raised one eyebrow for only a moment before releasing his hand. Claire has always surrounded herself with remarkable people. "Tell me, Graham, what line of work are you in?" "I am an accountant." The answer was simple, almost ordinary. Several guests exchanged amused glances. Someone quietly whispered, "An accountant." Another murmured, "That is unexpected." Damien smiled wider. "An honest profession. Numbers never lie." Graham nodded gently. "Sometimes people simply choose not to listen to them." One executive nearby gave a quiet laugh, uncertain whether it had been a joke or something deeper. Damien studied Graham again, sensing a confidence that did not fit the modest answer. Claire noticed it as well. She had expected Graham to appear uncomfortable in a room filled with billion-dollar negotiations and influential names. Instead, he seemed completely at peace, as though expensive suits and famous faces carried no more weight than ordinary strangers waiting in line at a neighborhood grocery store. Damien turned back toward Claire. "You always admired confidence," he said softly enough that only the three of them could hear. "I hope your new friend understands the kind of attention that comes with standing beside you." Claire answered with calm conviction. "He understands respect. That matters more." For the first time that evening, Damien's smile faded almost imperceptibly before returning. "Respect is important," he agreed. "So is knowing exactly who you are dealing with." Graham finally spoke again. "That is true for everyone." Their eyes met for only a second, but something unspoken passed between them. It was not hostility. It was recognition. Two men measuring character instead of status. Around them, the orchestra continued its elegant performance while waiters carried silver trays. Through the crowded ballroom, crystal glasses reflected warm light across polished marble, creating an atmosphere of celebration that almost concealed the growing tension beneath every polite smile. Then one of Damien's associates leaned toward him and quietly whispered a few words. Damien gave the slightest nod before glancing toward the three silent men waiting several yards away. Claire noticed the movement immediately. Graham noticed it even sooner. Without changing his expression, he quietly moved half a step closer to Claire, not to make a statement, but simply to ensure that if the evening tested anyone's character, she would not have to face it alone. The conversation around them slowly resumed, but the warmth had disappeared from the air. Smiles became cautious. Laughter sounded rehearsed. Even the musicians seemed to lower their volume without realizing why. Claire accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server, though she never took a sip. Graham noticed the faint reflection of her hand trembling against the crystal before she steadied it with quiet determination. Across the ballroom, Damien exchanged brief words with several investors, greeting each one with polished confidence, yet his attention kept returning to the pair standing near the grand staircase. He had spent years believing that every room eventually revolved around him. Tonight, for reasons he could not explain, the center of gravity had shifted. One of the board members from Claire's company approached with a pleasant smile. "Claire, everyone has been asking about your guest." She answered calmly. "His name is Graham." "Is he joining your finance division?" another executive asked with polite curiosity. Graham smiled gently before Claire could answer. "I only help people keep their numbers honest." The small group laughed, appreciating the modest humor, but an older accountant standing nearby nodded with unexpected respect. "That is harder than most people realize," he said. Graham inclined his head. "Usually because honesty costs something." The words were quiet, almost conversational, yet they lingered after the laughter faded. Claire glanced toward him with growing curiosity. Every answer he gave sounded simple, but somehow carried the weight of experience rather than cleverness. She realized she knew almost nothing about the man standing beside her. Earlier that afternoon she had only hoped he could help her avoid an embarrassing evening. Now she found herself wondering what kind of life could produce someone so completely unmoved by wealth, influence, or public attention. Across the room, one of Damien's associates whispered something again. This time Damien gave a visible nod. The three suited men who had remained near the entrance separated naturally, drifting through the ballroom as though admiring the artwork and greeting familiar faces. To anyone else, they appeared to be ordinary guests enjoying the evening. Graham quietly watched their reflections in the polished marble instead of turning his head. Years of careful observation had taught him that people often revealed more through patterns than words. Claire noticed his eyes following the reflections. "What is it?" she asked softly. "Nothing has happened," Graham replied. "I simply prefer to notice things before they become important." She looked toward the marble floor but saw nothing unusual. The three men appeared relaxed, speaking politely with guests while slowly reducing the distance between themselves and Damien. Graham's expression never changed. The orchestra transitioned into a slower piece, its gentle strings filling the elegant hall with peaceful harmony. Waiters carried trays of miniature desserts through clusters of conversations. A charity auction display shimmered beneath soft golden lights, showcasing artwork that would soon raise millions of dollars for children's hospitals across the country. It should have been a celebration of generosity. Instead, an invisible current of uncertainty continued spreading beneath every polished conversation. Damien finally returned, stopping several feet away with practiced confidence. "Claire," he said warmly, "some of our mutual friends would love to meet your guest." His tone was gracious, but his eyes searched Graham with careful calculation. Graham answered before Claire could respond. "I would be happy to meet anyone." Damien smiled. "Excellent. I believe introductions reveal far more than resumes." Graham returned the smile with calm sincerity. "Sometimes they do. Other times they simply reveal character." For a brief moment, neither man spoke. Around them, crystal glasses reflected the warm chandelier light while quiet conversations drifted across the ballroom like distant waves. Then the three suited men completed their slow approach, stopping respectfully several yards away, waiting without a word. Most guests never noticed them. Graham did. And somewhere deep within memories he had spent years leaving behind, an old instinct awakened with perfect calm, not with fear, not with anger, but with the quiet certainty that the peaceful evening was about to ask everyone in the room a simple question: who would choose dignity when pride invited something else? Damien's smile remained perfectly composed as he gestured toward a quieter corner of the ballroom where several influential guests had gathered beneath an enormous crystal chandelier. "Why do we not continue our conversation somewhere more comfortable?" he suggested. Claire immediately understood the invitation was not an invitation at all. It was an attempt to separate Graham from the crowd while preserving appearances. Before she could answer, Graham spoke with the same calm voice that had never once risen above ordinary conversation. "We are comfortable here." The response was polite. It was also final. A brief silence settled over the group. Damien chuckled softly as though he admired quiet confidence. "You know, Graham, most people become nervous at events like these." Graham smiled. "Most people have different reasons for being here." Several executives exchanged curious looks. They expected defensiveness from an ordinary accountant standing among billionaires. Instead they found someone who seemed completely untouched by status. Damien folded his hands. "Claire has always appreciated ambitious people. Tell me, what is your ambition?" Graham answered without hesitation. "To raise my daughter into someone who treats every person with respect." The words landed with surprising weight. An elderly philanthropist standing nearby lowered his glass and nodded almost imperceptibly. Claire looked at Graham with growing admiration. She had spent years surrounded by brilliant entrepreneurs who measured success in market value, acquisitions, and quarterly reports. She could not remember the last time someone had answered such a question without mentioning money, influence, or recognition. Damien noticed the change in her expression. His own smile tightened ever so slightly. "That is admirable," he said. "But surely a man wants more than a quiet life." Graham looked toward the ballroom windows where city lights shimmered across the river beyond the hotel. "Peace is not a small goal." Another silence followed. This one lasted longer. One of the three suited men stepped closer, remaining courteous as though simply waiting for instructions. Another casually positioned himself near the edge of the conversation. The third remained several yards away, watching the room with practiced awareness. Their movements were smooth enough that few guests paid attention, yet Graham noticed each adjustment without turning his head. Claire leaned closer. "They are getting closer." Graham answered softly enough that only she could hear. "Stay where you are." "Are you worried?" she asked. "No," he replied. "I simply do not want tonight to become something it does not need to become." Damien took another measured step forward. "Claire," he said warmly, "you deserve someone who understands your world." She lifted her chin. "My world is my decision." "And him?" Damien asked, glancing toward Graham. "Is he prepared for what comes with standing beside you?" Graham answered before Claire needed to. Standing beside someone is easier than standing above them. A few nearby guests quietly looked away, sensing that the conversation had moved beyond polite introductions. Even the musicians seemed to soften their performance until only the gentle sound of violins drifted through the ballroom. The air carried the faint scent of fresh flowers and polished wood, while reflections from hundreds of candles danced across the marble floor. Everything looked elegant. Everything sounded peaceful. Yet, beneath that polished surface, every attentive observer could feel an invisible line being drawn. Damien gave the slightest nod toward the three suited men. They approached with respectful expressions, stopping several feet from Graham as though they wished only to speak privately. One of them smiled courteously. "Sir, would you mind joining us for a brief conversation?" Graham studied each face with calm eyes before answering. "If it is truly a conversation, there is no reason for anyone to leave this room." The three men exchanged quick glances. Claire felt her heartbeat quicken, but Graham remained completely still. He neither challenged nor retreated. He simply stood with the quiet confidence of someone who had long ago learned that dignity often speaks loudest when it refuses to compete with pride. For several long seconds, no one moved. The three men remained where they were, courteous, composed, and patient. Graham met their eyes without challenge, his breathing slow and steady, his expression unchanged. The nearest man finally spoke again. "Sir, we would appreciate a private conversation." Graham answered with quiet respect. "If your intentions are honorable, privacy is unnecessary." His words were calm, yet they settled over the surrounding guests with unexpected weight. Claire could feel dozens of eyes shifting toward them, although almost everyone pretended to remain focused on their own conversations. The orchestra continued its gentle performance, but even the musicians sensed the unusual stillness spreading through the ballroom. Damien stepped forward with another polished smile. "There is no need for unnecessary tension. My associates simply wish to avoid an uncomfortable misunderstanding." Graham inclined his head slightly. "Then let us avoid one together." Damien's confidence faltered for only a heartbeat before returning. "Very well." One of the suited men extended an open hand, inviting Graham to walk with them. Graham looked briefly toward Claire. "Would you excuse me for a moment?" Before she could answer, the nearest man lightly reached toward Graham's sleeve, apparently intending only to guide him toward a quieter area. What happened next unfolded so naturally that many guests were not entirely certain what they had witnessed. Graham shifted one careful step to the side, gently redirecting the man's movement without force or aggression. The man immediately found himself slightly off balance, took one unexpected step forward, and instinctively steadied himself against a nearby column. There was no raised voice, no struggle, no anger. Only quiet precision. The second suited man reacted with visible surprise and instinctively reached out as though to help his colleague. Graham simply raised one open hand in a calm, reassuring gesture. "Easy," he said softly. "Nobody needs to fall." Somehow, the second man stopped where he stood, lowering his hands almost unconsciously as if responding to the confidence in Graham's voice rather than any command. The third man exchanged a quick glance with the others before taking one cautious step back instead of forward. His expression changed first. Curiosity replaced certainty. Around them, conversations faded into complete silence. Crystal glasses remained suspended halfway to smiling faces. A server carrying a silver tray stopped walking altogether. Even the orchestra allowed the final notes of the song to disappear without beginning another piece. Claire stared at Graham in disbelief. She had expected nervousness from him all evening. Instead, she had just witnessed extraordinary composure expressed with remarkable restraint. No one had been embarrassed. No one had been harmed. Yet somehow 3 highly trained professionals had quietly abandoned whatever plan they had arrived with. Graham offered each of them the same respectful nod. "Thank you," he said. "We all have responsibilities. I would rather tonight be remembered for generosity than pride." The nearest man slowly straightened his jacket before returning the nod with unexpected sincerity. "Understood, sir." The 3 men stepped back together without another word. Damien watched the exchange, and for the first time since entering the ballroom, genuine uncertainty appeared in his eyes. He had expected fear. He had expected hesitation. He had expected an ordinary accountant overwhelmed by extraordinary pressure. Instead, he had watched a man resolve a potentially difficult moment with nothing more than patience, awareness, and quiet authority. Graham returned to Claire's side as though nothing unusual had happened. "Are you all right?" he asked. Claire searched his face for an explanation but found only kindness. Before she could speak, a deep voice from across the ballroom broke the silence. "I knew I recognized that kind of discipline," the elderly gentleman said as he slowly set down his glass. Every head in the room turned toward him while Graham quietly closed his eyes for the briefest moment, as though a chapter he had hoped would remain in the past had finally caught up with him. The elderly gentleman walked forward with unhurried steps, his silver hair neatly combed, his black tuxedo adorned with a small American flag pin that few people had noticed earlier in the evening. The quiet confidence in his posture drew attention long before he spoke again. Several older guests immediately recognized him and respectfully stepped aside. Claire watched with growing curiosity. Damien's expression tightened. Graham remained still. The gentleman stopped a few feet away and studied Graham carefully, as though confirming something he had suspected from the beginning. Then a warm smile crossed his face. "It has been many years, Sergeant Mercer." A ripple of surprise spread through the ballroom. Graham lowered his eyes for a brief moment before extending his hand. "General Nathaniel Brooks," he said quietly. "It is good to see you again, sir." The retired general accepted the handshake firmly. "I never thought I would find you at a charity gala pretending to be an ordinary accountant." A few guests laughed softly, assuming it was only a joke. The general looked around the room and gently shook his head. "Ladies and gentlemen, I assure you, there is nothing ordinary about this man." Complete silence followed. Even the hotel staff paused where they stood. Damien folded his arms, attempting to maintain his composure. "General," he said politely, "perhaps there has been some misunderstanding." The older man turned toward him with calm dignity. "No misunderstanding at all." His eyes returned to Graham. "Years ago, when our nation asked young men and women to carry impossible burdens, Sergeant Graham Mercer answered without seeking recognition. He completed missions that will never appear in history books because some acts of service remain classified long after the people involved return home." Claire felt her breath catch. She looked toward Graham, who seemed almost uncomfortable with every word being spoken. "Sir," Graham interrupted gently, "that chapter belongs in the past." General Brooks smiled kindly. "Perhaps for you. But character never belongs only to the past." He addressed the gathering once more. "Many of you measure success by companies built, markets expanded, or fortunes earned. Those accomplishments deserve respect. But there is another kind of success that cannot be listed on a balance sheet. It is the quiet decision to protect others without asking for applause." Graham shifted slightly, wishing the attention would move elsewhere. "General, please." "One more thing," Brooks replied softly. After his military service, Graham declined opportunities that would have made him wealthy. Instead, he chose to raise his daughter, care for his family, and live a life that reflected the same discipline he showed in uniform. He never requested special treatment. He never introduced himself by rank. He simply became the kind of father every child deserves. Claire's eyes filled with emotion she had not expected. Suddenly his patience, his humility, and his remarkable calm all made perfect sense. They had never been an act. They were the habits of a man who had spent years placing responsibility ahead of recognition. Around the ballroom, whispers faded into thoughtful silence. The three suited men who had approached Graham earlier stood respectfully with their hands folded in front of them. One of them gave the slightest nod of admiration. Damien looked from the retired general to Graham and then back again, as though searching for evidence that this revelation could somehow be explained away. Instead, he found only quiet respect reflected in the faces surrounding him. Graham finally spoke, his voice as steady as it had been. "All evening. General, I appreciate your kindness. But tonight is about helping children and families. I would rather people remember that than remember me." General Brooks smiled with unmistakable pride. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is precisely why men like Graham Mercer are remembered long after medals are put away. The silence lingering after General Brooks's words felt different from ordinary silence. It was not born from surprise alone. It was the quiet that arrives when assumptions collapse under the weight of truth. Around the ballroom, conversations slowly resumed, but their tone had changed completely. People who had dismissed Graham only minutes earlier now greeted him with genuine respect rather than polite obligation. Several business leaders introduced themselves, not because they hoped to gain an advantage, but because they wanted to shake the hand of a man whose character had spoken louder than his resume ever could. Graham responded to each greeting with the same humble smile, thanking every person without lingering in the attention. Claire watched him closely. She had spent years learning how easily success could change people. Recognition often invited pride. Wealth often encouraged distance. Yet Graham carried admiration as lightly as he had carried anonymity. Nothing about him seemed different because nothing inside him had changed. Damien noticed it as well, and for the first time that evening, confidence gave way to reflection. He looked toward the three suited professionals who had accompanied him. The oldest among them stepped forward quietly and spoke with respectful honesty. "Sir, we owe Mr. Mercer an apology. He treated every one of us with courtesy." Damien frowned. "You are saying this in front of everyone?" The man nodded without hesitation. "Because it is true." The other two men agreed with silent expressions of respect. One added, "Real strength is easier to recognize when it chooses restraint." Their words carried farther than they intended, reaching nearby guests who quietly exchanged thoughtful glances. Damien lowered his eyes for a brief moment before looking toward Graham again. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "I judged you too quickly." Graham answered with gentle sincerity. "We have all done that to someone at some point." There was no accusation in his voice. No satisfaction. Only grace. General Brooks smiled quietly, recognizing the lesson unfolding without anyone needing to raise their voice. Claire felt something inside her begin to heal. For years she had believed that leadership meant always proving herself, always standing taller, speaking louder, achieving more than everyone expected. Standing beside Graham, she discovered another kind of leadership entirely. The strongest person in the room had never tried to become its center. He had simply chosen respect every time pride offered him another path. A representative from the Children's Hospital approached the stage and gently tapped the microphone, inviting everyone to gather for the evening's fundraising announcement. Guests slowly filled the ballroom once again. Before stepping away, Damien looked at Claire. "I hope your future is kinder than our past," he said quietly. Claire offered a small, sincere nod. "I hope yours is too." There was no bitterness left between them, only the quiet understanding that some chapters were meant to end so better ones could begin. As applause filled the room for the charity's record-breaking donations, Graham slipped almost unnoticed toward the back of the ballroom, content to let the evening return to its true purpose. Claire watched him disappear into the crowd for a moment before following at a comfortable distance. She no longer saw an accountant standing alone after a difficult evening. She saw a father whose greatest accomplishment had never been hidden in military records or professional titles. It was written instead in the quiet consistency of a life built on dignity, compassion, and the simple choice to place others before himself. 1 week later, the city had already moved on to new headlines, new business deals, and new conversations, but Graham Mercer's life looked almost exactly the same as it had before the gala. At 7 o'clock every morning, he packed Lily's lunch, checked her homework one last time, and drove her to school in the same dependable sedan that had carried them through years of ordinary mornings. As they pulled into the school parking lot, Lily smiled across the front seat. "You remembered the extra apple slices." Graham laughed softly. "I know, my favorite customer." She reached over and hugged him before climbing out with her backpack nearly as big as she was. "Have a good day, Dad." "You too, sweetheart." He waited until she disappeared safely through the front doors before driving to the accounting office where another stack of tax reports and financial statements patiently waited on his desk. His co-workers greeted him exactly as they always had. No one mentioned the gala. No one spoke about retired generals or elegant ballrooms. Graham preferred it that way. Peace, he had learned, was often found in ordinary routines shared with people who cared more about character than reputation. Late that afternoon, as the golden light of early evening stretched across the parking lot, Graham stepped outside carrying a worn leather briefcase. A familiar luxury sedan rolled quietly to the curb. Claire Whitmore stepped out, dressed not in a designer evening gown or an executive business suit, but in simple jeans, a light sweater, and comfortable walking shoes. Without the spotlight of cameras or boardrooms, she looked less like one of the country's most respected chief executive officers and more like someone finally able to breathe. Graham smiled with genuine surprise. "This is a long way from your office." Claire returned the smile. "Some destinations are worth the drive." For a moment neither of them spoke. The gentle breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass from a nearby park while children laughed on a playground across the street. It was a world completely different from crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors. Claire looked toward the school where parents were arriving to pick up their children. "General Brooks told me something after you left that night," she said quietly. Graham raised an eyebrow. "That can be dangerous." She laughed. He said the finest leaders eventually discover that protecting one heart is every bit as meaningful as leading 1,000 people. Graham looked toward the playground, where Lily was running with friends. He always knew how to say more with fewer words. Claire followed his gaze. "May I ask you something?" "Of course." "Would you let me take both of you to dinner tonight?" Graham looked at her for a long second before glancing toward Lily, who had just noticed Claire and waved enthusiastically with the fearless curiosity only children possess. Claire waved back, her smile effortless and sincere. Lily hurried over and whispered, just loudly enough for both adults to hear, "Dad, she looks nice." Graham smiled at his daughter before meeting Claire's eyes once again. "I think we would like that." As the three of them walked together toward a small family restaurant instead of an exclusive private club, the evening sun painted the sidewalks in warm shades of gold. There were no cameras waiting. No applause followed them. No one stopped to ask about military service, billion-dollar companies, or forgotten moments inside a ballroom. There was only the quiet rhythm of ordinary footsteps and the gentle sound of a little girl happily talking about school, books, and her dream of becoming someone who helped people every day. Sometimes the greatest victories are never celebrated by crowds. They unfold quietly in everyday moments where dignity chooses kindness, where respect outlives pride, and where a good heart finally finds another that recognizes its worth. Real heroes rarely announce themselves. They simply continue showing up, one ordinary day at a time, until their quiet example changes far more lives than they will ever know. Thanks for spending your time with us today. If this story meant something to you, don't forget to subscribe and support the channel. And I'm curious, how old are you, and did this story feel relatable to you? Let me know in the comments. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.